Welcome everyone to Video Chess Training. This is my YouTube channel. I'm International Master William Paschall, and today we're taking a look at a review of my last Simul on lichess.org. We're going to take a look at 3 or 4 games here for your viewing enjoyment that were played by me in this 40 plus 40 second increment Simul every Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Central European Summertime. I'm playing. This is against one of our regular followers, Geese. I'm playing black, and I played e5. White plays knight f3, knight c6, and then the Scotch. This was a difficult game for me because I don't know that much theory for black, and I'm not a lifetime e4, e5 player. So black principally has to take on d4 here. Knight takes d4, and now knight to f6 is one of the main moves. Bishop c5 is the other one. I've also experimented with g6 here, kind of a sideline variation that I don't really think is as sound or correct. So having played that earlier against him, I think in another game, I went into what is a main line, bishop to c5, and now knight takes c6 is one of the main lines for white. Bishop e3 and c3. c3 not a really common move order. I think bishop e3, this is the game. And now black in this position, obviously the bishop on c5 is hanging, so we play the main move, queen f6, and now the game enters in a very unusual continuation, knight to b5. And this apparently is a theoretical line that should be okay for black, but over the board, this was my most interesting game in Sunday's Simul because I wasn't aware of this variation's even existence. So again, you know, I'm limited to what I know in the Scotch game. I had to kind of figure this out over the board. So the following move is basically forced. Bishop takes e3, and black is threatening mate on f2 with the queen. So knight takes c7 check, not really an option here. White has to recapture on e3. We get a position that's very irrational. Black is on the verge of falling behind in development, but most importantly has to defend the pawn on c7 in some way. So here I was really unsure about what to do, and I spent literally like 6 or 7 minutes of my precious 40 minutes in the Simul thinking about what to do with black in this one game. And pretty quickly I decided that queen takes b2 is too dangerous for black. So the problem is that if you even eliminate queen takes b2, we still have, if you see here in the table, 4 candidate moves for black, and it's hard to say which one is best. King d8 looks to me like a pretty serious long-term concession, so that was my least favorite of the moves. Queen e5, defending c7. The problem with queen e5 is that it's difficult to continue the development with d6 if the queen is protecting the c7 pawn from the position on e5. So white really needs to continue actively, and we need to defend something that's like long-term. So I didn't really like king d8, I didn't really like queen e5, but I didn't appreciate here really, and I still am not 100% sure, the value of queen h4. It's quite subtle. So queen h4 check is not what I played. I played queen d8, but I decided to play a solid move at the end. Most of the top players seem to be playing queen h4 check, inducing g3. When there's a branch, black can either retreat back to d8, which looks like the most solid, or play queen takes e4, which is very unclear. And I didn't understand really the benefits of forcing g3. It turns out if we see what happened in the game, we can see the benefits of kind of including g3 for black. So g3 and then queen d8. I think this is what I would play if I had to do it over again. We see Onishuk, Alexander, Hare Krishna playing for black. These are relatively old games, but still good players playing this line for black. Normally queen g4 for white, as in my game, but we'll see the difference here. So I played instead this move, queen to d8 right away after knight to b5, and queen g4. My opponent here knows the theory to some extent. This position is interesting. Now, Black has a choice between really g6 and king f8, and I don't know which one is better objectively, but it seems like white's score against g6 is quite imposing. King f8 weakens less squares, and I kind of liked it, and I saw that I can kind of blockade on the dark squares this position. So I think g6 is interesting. We see quite a few games with that, but king f8 looks like the more solid move. The difference, though, if we had included queen h4 check, is that white would have played g3 here. And when I looked at the position, I kind of thought, well, that might benefit white. You know, maybe he'll have options to play bishop g2, bishop h3. He wouldn't have otherwise. And I didn't see how the weakening of the position was that significant with g3. But perhaps the most important feature of the position that's changed is the fact that white could possibly put the queen on g3. In the main line, in this position, white oftentimes plays queen f4 to attack c7. But without g3, he could also play queen g3 in some positions. So an additional square for the queen and the white pieces is kind of an advantage that I don't have to give him. In the game, we have king f8, queen f4, d6, and then very active move bishop c4 here, attacking f7. And I opted to play, of course, knight f6. And we can put the other knight on e5. This position reminds me, in terms of the dynamics of the position, kind of like a very sharp variation of the Sicilian, something like that, where white is the Caraclage variation of the classical Sicilian, for example, where white allows these damaged pawns in exchange for dynamic possibilities with the pieces. It's very imbalanced. It's probably about a dynamic equality, but again, I've played this kind of position in the Sicilian, so I was kind of happy to be in a position where I knew what I'm supposed to do. I have a static advantage, and we need to hunker down and kind of solidify. But quickly I made a very serious mistake. We have knight c3, knight e5, which I think is reasonable, and then bishop b3. It looks like white should have played bishop back to e2. It's very tempting to play bishop b3 where the bishop remains active, but with the bishop on e2, white would control this diagonal e2, h5 and take away potential aggressive moves that I have, like bishop g4, knight g4, knight h5. So it looks like this was an inaccuracy by Geese here with bishop b3. And now quickly I made a terrible catastrophic mistake. It's a harmless looking move. I played here c6, but it just basically like loses by force. I wanted to play c6 because I wanted to kick the knight out and have the control of d5 at the same time. But apparently I have to play a6 here. And controlling d5 is a little trickier. After a6, knight d4, I think the position is about dynamically equal. But I played in the game c6 instead, and this allows an amazing tactical resource. White can just temporarily sacrifice a piece with castles queenside, and basically a winning attack. I can't defend d6, and he's threatening queen takes e5. And if I take the knight here, just queen takes e5. And white is tactically just clearly winning. So neither of us saw this in the quick pace of the Simul game, but c6 is a terrible blunder. Have to play a6 there. And then in the game I consolidated c6, knight d4, and black's slightly better now. I played this move, knight h5, queen f2, and then my idea was to trade queens here with queen f6. But white makes a slight mistake. He shouldn't trade queens in this position where white has a dynamically active pieces but a bad structure. So knight f3, avoiding the exchange of queens, was a strong move. And once I can trade queens, then I'm better. Queen takes f2, rook takes f2, knight f6, and now my king can go to e7. Knight on f6 shields my king, and problem solved. Also, this is a move I'm proud of, h5. I think it's fairly obvious, but we can kind of activate the rook from its original square on h8. And then knight f5. I think this is maybe a mistake because arguably I want to trade a bishop for a good knight in this kind of position and lock things up on the dark squares. Bishop takes f5. Pawn takes f5, correcting his pawn structure. Maybe I could play d5 here, but I played instead h4, and he played e4. But he's got a lot of pawns on the white squares. h3, g2, f5, e4. A lot of white square pawns, and he's got a bad bishop on b3. So black has a kind of clear advantage. Rook to d1, rook to d8. I think in retrospect, It would be nice to put the other rook there, but I have to watch out for rook f4. So we try to set up on the dark squares a4, another pawn on the white squares. And the positional advantage is in black's court here. Rook d7, king f2, rook a8. This is a classic accelerated dragon idea. And Geese is a player who's also trying to play the accelerated dragon. So maybe he'll appreciate this idea of rook a6, b6, rook b4, which is using the accelerated dragon. And then, accordingly, white had the chance to play king f4, king g5. A very brave kind of walk with the king, but he needs to play aggressively. And knight e2 doesn't really help his position. So we're able to get a greater grip on the dark squares and kind of take over the game here. The knight not doing a whole lot from f4. Looking pretty, but not really constructively contributing to the position. Rook to b4, rook to d4. We've got a clear advantage here, and we can just improve. We take the pressure off of d6, trade one rook, and go back around with the other rook. I'm not saying this is a winning position for black, but it's a clearly better position. And white makes a positional mistake here to trade minor pieces. He really should perhaps not give me this clear knight, good knight versus bad bishop type of position. And he was fighting here. c3. This is like the fatal mistake, not just tactically, but positionally. I don't want to take on d3, and as long as he can take back with the pawn on d3. But c3 is the losing move. But strategically, I mean, even if I don't win the exchange here, this is not a move he really wants to make. I understand he wants to free his bishop on b3, but if I can trade knights and you can't recapture with the pawn there, white is like clearly worse positionally. But here he just loses the exchange, and after some more moves, black was clearly winning. So that was, I think, the most interesting game of the Simul stream. But there were some others I'd like to go over. In particular, the following game against Pilot 100, we had. Let me find it here. We had another game. Let me find this. All right. So Sunday. On Monday, it's Sunday. Pilot 100. Here it is. This I thought was a really interesting struggle. It's a reversed Grunfeld. So we played g3 on move 1. I like to mix up different kind of openings when I'm playing with white. And this was one of the rare games where I played g3. Black played d5. And now knight f3, because I don't want to go into a reverse Pirz. I don't think that white can really get an advantage if we allow black to play e5 there. So we still have hope for an opening advantage here. c5, bishop g2, and then knight to c6. And now if I castle, it's a king's Indian, and black should have enough space to comfortably equalize. So d4 is really the critical move here, going into a kind of reverse Grunfeld or Catalan. e6 is the safest move. Knight f6 is okay. But he plays in the spirit of a normal Grunfeld, and this is kind of risky because the Grunfeld is sharp opening and you're playing a tempo down. C takes d4, knight takes d4. Now, safest would be something like knight f6, I guess. Black plays e5, knight takes c6, and b takes c. And we see there are some brave players who are willing to play this. Zlatko Alincic, Solskis, Kuprejcik. Well, what are these strong grandmasters, you know, all of them who have been like around 2600, what do these strong grandmasters have in common if we look at this list here? They're absolute maniacs. Alincic, I can certify, is a chess maniac. Solskis plays the, you know, variation with knight takes f7 in the Petrov for white. And Kuprejcik has a reputation, you know, of a player who's just absolutely legendary. So these guys, you know, they know that this is very risky to do this with black, but anyway, they're willing to try it anyway. It's a little crazy to play a tempo down in the Grunfeld, but Pilot 100 tries to do it too. Now, maybe I should play c4 here. Objectively, that's what we did. Okay, and now there are some interesting tries. Maybe black could trade pieces with bishop b4 check. That's interesting to trade pieces. For me, seems like a reasonable idea for black. Knight f6, and now castles, bishop e7. And here's an interesting position, because if we look in this limited database here, knight c3 seems like the most aggressive move. But I had a problem with this. Now, I don't know the theory too deeply, but if I play knight to c3, what I was worried about is this very, very rare move here, d4. And we find just 2 games. Jan Isbarl is playing white in one and Stefanova in another. And this is what I was scared of over the board, this variation. Bishop takes c6 check, bishop d7, and bishop takes a8. Queen takes a8, and I'm not sure about this. You know, this looks like a really entertaining and interesting way for black to play. So, two possible moves here, knight b5 and knight d5. Maybe knight d5, as Paschall played. I think Stefanova played knight b5, and after castles, it looks like this opponent of Stefanova sort of had clearly enough compensation for the exchange. So f3, it's a typical Grunfeld idea, second exchange like this. Bishop h3. Stefanova played rook e1 here. Maybe you could play rook f2. It's hard to say. It's not the kind of position I'm really interested in playing where the other guy or woman has the kind of dynamic initiative. So maybe Janez Barlow's idea of playing knight d5 makes some sense in this position, to give the material back. But in this case, after knight takes d5, c takes d5, queen takes d5. Now, at this point, we're up in exchange. Queen b3. Barlow was a quite, and still, I think he's still alive, but not sure, was a quite good player. Queen b3. This maybe looks like the right try. This game, Barlow versus Stepan. So I would say white is better here, but it's unclear enough that it would still be kind of a difficult game. Black has a full exchange down after queen a8, and this is actually a game from 1992. It's very, very sharp. f4 this computer wants to play, but hard to say. I was afraid to go into this over the board, but I think it's really an interesting line and worthy of further exploration. So c takes d4 instead. We played c takes d5, excuse me. c takes d5, c takes d5, now knight to c3, and my opponent played bishop e6. Pretty rare position. Black could play e4 right away, kind of similar to the game. Bishop e6. I played bishop g5, probably best, and now e4, protecting the pawn on d5. So in this position, we follow just a few games. There is a strong player here, Nick Sands. It's a Latvian 2600 player. I didn't really know too much about him, but strong. So here I think we followed best move, queen a4 check. And then things get interesting. So my opponent played bishop d7. Apparently queen d7 is okay. Queen d7, queen takes d7, knight takes d7, and white is a little bit better. Nick Sands played bishop takes e7 in this position, but perhaps we can think about keeping the pieces on the board. This would be a new move. This game, Nick Sands versus Bergina, bishop e3, possible. Would consider it. Well, I would consider bishop e3 here. But black's bishop might get strong on f6, so there is one game. Bishop takes e7, king takes e7. White wins this somehow. It looks like black has kind of good chances to hang on in this position. So I'm not convinced by this ending. This looks like the best chance for black. Instead, my opponent played bishop d7 in my Simul on Sunday. And we have bishop d7, and the game goes into this game. Icelandic international master Hardarson played this variation for black in a tournament game. Queen d4, and my opponent now bishop e6. So Hardarson played bishop c6, not allowing checks. Obviously bishop e6 a bit of a more natural square. A novelty here, perhaps. Don't have a complete database. And then Pilot 100, our opponent from Poland, blundered with h6, but I didn't see how strong it is to simply take on f6. Simply takes on f6, black is basically busted. Bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6. For some reason, playing all these boards, 20 boards at the same time, I didn't realize how discoordinated black is here. After this, queen a4 check, it's just too strong. And white has a winning position. Basically, I'm going to be winning a clear pawn here after queen a4 check. But there was no need for black to play h6. This is just a blunder. After castles, we're in a normal position where white has a slight advantage, but I don't think that it's that significant. It would have been very similar to the game, actually. over the board. F3 is a normal kind of idea. White has a very, very tiny advantage, similar to the game. So we had H6, Bishop E3, keeping, I didn't see Bishop takes F6, castles, and now F3. Breaking up the pawn center thematically. E takes F4, E3, E takes F3, excuse me, and now Queen A5. And I thought that Pilot 100 played this really well. This point for the next 15 moves, he was between equal and even slightly better maybe in some moment. King H1, a safe move. Rook F8, and very active play. Notice how black doesn't put his rook behind the D pawn. It's very important when you play against an isolated pawn that you aim for activity. You don't passively defend your isolated pawn. You use the isolated pawn just as a means for gaining space, and you're looking for activity constantly, not passive defense. So Queen D2, Rook D8. This is a mistake, I think. He was on the right path with Rook C8, but then Rook D8, Bishop D4. This is not the right position for the Rook now on D8. Rook C8, Rook E1, and then Knight H7. White seems better now. I could have made progress on the queen side with A3. This is a kind of Karpovian move. But with so many boards in play, I was kind of afraid to weaken myself. But ultimately, I think I should be thinking about ways to make it work tactically that I can advance my queenside pawns. Because this queenside duo on the queenside A2, B2 against the A7 pawn, theoretically that's my advantage in this position. That's how I should win the game. So A3 creeping forward on the queen side. But instead I played a routine move here, Rook E2. And black trades dark squared bishops. I missed a very strong tactic now with Knight E4. Did not see it. Knight E4, Queen takes D2, Knight takes F6 check with a very strong position. I also looked at two bishops there and a queenside majority, probably positionally winning. I also looked at Queen takes A2, but after Knight takes F6 check, Knight takes F6, Bishop takes F6, Pawn takes F6. Black's position is kind of in ruins here on the king side. So I don't think that's looking like a very, very bad Tarrasch type position for black. So we tried to play, but we didn't see the tactic here. So we played Queen E1, and black played actively Rook C4, Rook D2. The position is balanced now. Rook B8, this is okay, seeking activity. Bishop takes F6, Knight takes F6. Dynamic equilibrium here, black with enough active compensation for the isolated pawn. Bishop F1, Rook C6, A3. Finally, it's a little bit late to be playing A3, but it's the right idea. And then Queen C5, Queen F2, and I'm looking for exchanges because I was getting into a very bad time pressure at this point. And black trades queens. This is okay though. He has enough pressure against my B pawn in this position to compensate. Rook B3 would have been a strong move, preventing B4. Black didn't find it, played the logical move King F8 instead. Played Rook D2, King E7, centralizing the king. Can't argue with that. And then King G1, A5 to stop B4 seemed okay. It's about equal here. King F2. And now black needs to play Rook B6, but instead played D4. This is just a miscalculation. So D4, instead of D4, Rook B6 with an equal game. I mean, I think we're just going to have to try to force a draw somehow with white here. If Rook B6, white has to be very careful. Knight A4, probably forced. And I don't think there's any way, if anything, black might be a tiny bit better here. We could repeat moves with Rook C6, or black could try to even play for more with Rook B3 or Rook B7. So he just blundered. He blundered with D4 in this position. It's a miscalculation. Hoping for Rook takes D4, but I don't have to take. That's what he kind of misevaluated. I just play Knight E2, and now black is in trouble. Black is going to probably lose a pawn now, and this is what happens. Rook B6, Knight takes D4, and he saw only too late that after Rook takes B2, I have Knight C6 check, and white is winning now. Bishop D5, Knight F5 check, forcing his king back, and then King F8. And it's not that simple, though. I mean, maybe black isn't lost here. After Rook takes D5, Knight takes D5, Rook takes D5. I'm not saying that black is necessarily lost, but clearly it's an unpleasant position where white has a clear advantage. Theoretically, we could have to have discussions about knight, bishop, and 3 pawns against rook and 3 pawns on the same side of the board. Very possibly it's a draw. Rook takes B2 check, bishop E2, and then Rook E8. and knight e3. And in this position, it looks like white is clearly better. I wouldn't say winning yet, though. Rook b3, rook d3, and now he could trade rooks. But he plays rook b2 instead, g6, and only later weakens his king side. I think king g7, king f3, h5, giving me the chance to play f5. And I'm not sure that black is lost here. It's kind of close. But if I'm able to create a second weakness on the king side with these two minor pieces, I think I'd have good winning chances. Eventually there was a blunder. Rook e5, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, rook d7 check, and now king h6. This is the blunder, kind of putting his king into a bad position. So king f6 toward the center, much more natural. Black still fighting there. After king h6, he kind of walks into a sort of mating net here with g4, which is really nasty. So there's no saving black's position now. He's losing by force after this. So I needed some help to win this game. Bishop d3, pawn takes h4, rook h7 check, and we win material in this line. Rook takes h5, king f6, rook takes e5, and then I have knight c4, followed by knight takes b2. So black resigned. Anyway, I thought this was a really, really interesting game. And I'd like to thank those guys. And we'll take a look at one more game here. We had some interesting struggles as well that weren't quite as perhaps well-played games. But interesting positions. Go back to Monday. My Simul every week on lichess.org. It's 6:30 p.m. CEST. There is an interesting game here I played with this guy from Romania. If I can find it. We are not finding it. Okay, last Friday, 6:10. Here we go. On the right day now. 6:10. Where is this game trying to find? Alright. Here it is. Alright. Pilot 100. We move down the list here. And pawn shaped 1, 2, 3. I thought this was an interesting game to take a look at. We go to the analysis board. Unusual opening here. My opponent played c4, I played e5, g3, knight f6, and now bishop g2, and I like this variation with c6, kind of a c3 Sicilian reversed against the hyper-accelerated dragon. For some reason, I'm not seeing it lately when I try to play this line, but the main line is d4. I also play this for white, and after d4, bishop b4 check. A lot of games that Grandmaster Shuba Mihai has played with like e takes d4, queen takes d4. This is another line. I don't really like playing this for black. I actually prefer playing this type of line for white. So I've always preferred to play bishop b4 check here. This variation you see here, Mamedyarov, Rajabov, for example. This variation I always thought is pretty solid for black. Bishop takes d2, queen takes d2. Now the idea is d6. Play a kind of Bogo Indian, very solid Bogo Indian type formation for black here. So that's the plan. But my opponent didn't go into that. He plays instead knight c3, and I see this a lot. But I don't think that white can get an advantage by any means here. d5, cd5, cd5. And the problem is that if you play d4, your knight is on c3. And this isn't really good for white. After pawn takes pawn, queen takes, knight c6. And black is simply... There's even a game, Larsen, Ulf Anderson, 1982. I mean, it's just not good for... It's just bad for white, this position. Queen a4 and d4. This is the idea. And black has space. There are some serious problems for white in this position. We see like knight e4, knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, and I assume bishop e4 check. So, I mean, white is kind of fighting for equality We see some games with some strong players with black, like Iescas is black, king f1. Perhaps white can equalize here, but the white is playing for equality at best in this position, and that's not really a good thing. So not a good variation for white to allow this. White has got to bail out and beg for equality there. So there is this move queen b3, which is kind of interesting. We see Hodgson, Iescas, Mikhail Gurevich versus Sveshnikov. Lost. White is losing. Black has 51% in this variation after knight c6. So I think that's enough evidence that, you know, again, white is probably fighting for equality after knight takes d5, knight to d4. This is not a variation with white that I want any part of. White has the initiative in this line. So I think this is really dangerous for white and not to be recommended. Avoid this move order when you're playing with the white pieces. So my opponent comes up with something new here. Maybe not entirely new, but interesting. Knight c3, d5, c takes d5, c takes d5, and e3. And this is a rare position, only 2 games. Notably, Klaudia Kulan from Poland, she's becoming a strong player and recently did quite well for the Polish Olympiad team in Baku. She actually played this position for white. But notably, both of these players play knight c6. This is a stupid move for black. You must play d4. This is obvious. You know, for me, it's very, very fundamental, and that's why I wanted to include it in this recap of the Sunday Simul, because this is a very obvious thing to me, and neither this player or this player, 2400, 2300, understands that you have to play d4 in this position. It's very strange. This move is absolutely essential. So d4. And we're on our own here. I don't know what to recommend. E takes d4 seems okay. E takes d4. And now, according to the computer, white has to be very, very careful. Queen a4 check, apparently, is maybe best. Some tricky move like queen a4 check, knight c6, and then I think knight e4 or knight e2 in this position. This additional move, queen a4 check, not sure. I like white again, but it's probably a slight improvement over the text. So instead, my opponent played knight e2, and here I made a mistake. I played knight c6. This is kind of forgiving move. I shouldn't give white the chance to play d3. I should play d3 right away. This is best, and I continue to play thematically. d3, for example, knight c3 I analyzed, and now bishop c5, I think, with a very aggressive position. And I think that this is a position where white is going to have to be very, very careful not to lose, like right out of the opening, requiring accurate play just to hang on for white here. So bishop c5 looks very strong for me, and I don't think that knight f4 is very good either. I have g5 sometimes in this type of position. It's just a kind of nasty position. So not recommended for white. I wanted to include this. I gave white a second chance. I played knight c6, and white should play d3. White should jump at the chance to play d3 here, but he or she did not. Play knight f3. Again, I have another chance. This time I played it, d3. It's not quite as good as it was last move. White plays knight to c3 now. And I tried to play incisively here. Bishop c5 to me seemed a little bit late. You know, white's castling. So I wanted to punish white. I played queen e7 check, forcing king f1, and maybe I had a better way of playing than I did in the game. I'm not really sure. I didn't see anything clear with knight b4, so I decided here g6 to develop my king side. I think it was reasonable. g6, queen e1. This is a sensible defensive move. Trading queens. I didn't want to do that, so bishop e6. Black maintains slight advantage. Then knight to g5, and in this position, there are many moves I could make. I decided to give up the bishop for the sake of time. Knight to d4, threatening knight c2. Maybe better just to play a developing move like bishop g7. I think this is very principled. But I wanted to show everybody where I went wrong in this game to let white off the hook. Knight d4, not developing. I think I should just develop. Try to out-develop white thematically here. Instead I played knight d4, kind of a cheapo. White played knight takes e6, and then I made a bad move. I should probably take with the f-pawn in this position. Continue to play for activity, but I took back with the knight. And suddenly, after knight takes, white is okay. The computer evaluation changes, and so I need to play thematically for development. Development. Punish white's lack of development here. So this was a mistake. Knight takes e6. Suddenly I was worried about my pawn structure. I was like, uh-oh, I'm getting low on time. I don't want to lose my d3 pawn. I better be careful. But this goes against the way I've been playing the game very actively with d5, d4, d3. And now suddenly I'm going to be concerning myself about just maintaining my pawn structure. This was hesitating in a big way, you know. So this was the beginning of my mistakes. Recapturing with the pawn, keeping the active knight on d4 was a lot more thematic and a lot more dynamic. So I played knight takes e6, and then white played, this is perhaps a tactical mistake, knight to d5. White should focus on development here. Queen e3, probably queen e3, rook d8, and it's dynamic equality, something like dynamic equality. But instead, white played knight d5, another chance for me. Knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, and white again falls behind in development. But there is the problem with king g2. So I wasn't really sure about this position. You know, I'm kind of afraid of king g2, white consolidating their position. I played bishop g7, and then queen e4. I thought this is a very strange move. I expected king to g2 in this position. And I would think after king g2, white is more or less kind of like getting out of the worst of the trouble. But still, if you see this bishop on c1 is a piece that can't move. So ultimately, white does have some strategic problems because of bishop g7 and the pawn on d3. Maybe black is still clearly better. I was afraid white is getting out of trouble here, but queen e4 not developing, and then I did this move. This is just the unthinkable thing to do in this position. I'm ahead in development, and white can't move. The bishop on c1 can't develop the queen side, and I started to worry about material with knight to c5. Mostly because of time. I didn't have time to really think clearly, but this position castles, and black is clearly better. White, you know, we don't care about material in this type of position. If white takes on d3, I have pins, I have development advantage. It's still a clear advantage, and I think I should keep the queens on the board. But instead, I played knight c5, and then after the exchange of queens, it looks like white is hanging on. King takes, king g2, king d6. This is a little bit dodgy, but I didn't want my king on the e file where I can get checked. So bishop c4, and now I didn't find b5, which is a very active move. Played a6, it's a little slower. And then I'm surprised by a4. I mean, rook b1 seems like a very logical move here by white. But I think he was worried about b5. But probably rook b1, b5, and the f7 is hanging for one thing. But b4 is a counter move. It also has b4. This is kind of unclear. So I thought that white, this was an interesting game. White played risky chess, not really getting developed, but I didn't really play consistently enough in this game. A little hesitant when I needed to be aggressive. And even now b5, that's kind of a tough move to find. So I played rook c8, not the best, and then rook a3, and suddenly I started to panic that I was even losing after rook a3. b5, I found this move. Actually, this is probably best. A takes b, bishop takes f7, and this is the end of the game. After bishop takes f7, rook takes, b takes, and here my opponent offered a draw, which I accepted in time pressure. It looks like black has compensation for the sacrificed pawn, but not necessarily more. So I think this was actually a fair moment to call it a draw. I won't say that I'm better because I'm down a pawn, but I do have clear compensation. So I thought, really interesting game, and we can take a look, perhaps one last game before we wrap up this review of the Sunday Simul stream. Last game I wanted to take a look at from last week. This was Sunday, and we're on to the games here. Pilot 100. So now I'm looking for the game pawn. No, I'm looking for ILG. We played against ILG. Here it is. This game isn't that complicated as the others. This game is more of a positional game. It's a King's Indian attack. White against ILG from Russia. We have a standard, this is a good system for black against the King's Indian attack, but I really prefer the lines with bishop g4. And ILG played g6 instead. d3, bishop g7, knight d2, castles, and now e4. And d takes e4 is the main line here, but I don't know. It just feels like in principle, to me it just seems like in principle, black is trading off the strong point on d5. And it's very difficult for me to really comprehend, how that can be black's best move. But nevertheless, the most popular. We've seen some good players play this line with black. D takes e4, d takes e4, and now bishop g4. There's a lot of moves that can be played here. Knight a6, queen c7. I don't like c5. Bishop g4, giving up the white squared bishop. h3, bishop takes f3, and a number of games here, though no really strong players with black. Volzhin, Gagunashvili. Kashishvili, just a phenomenal positional player. He's, it's not surprising he would take out somebody with white. He's such a good player in these sorts of positions. Queen takes f3, knight on bd7, and shockingly, Morozevich Anand, 2007. I would think that Anand wouldn't want to touch this kind of variation with black when it looks like black is just kind of like worse positionally long term without any real active chances. Lerner, also a good player, but who knows, maybe it was a rapid game where Anand decided to play this line. Queen e2, e5, and now I played a new move, apparently knight c4. So there's a lot of good moves here. Rook d1, b3, a4. Instead I played knight c4, kind of a neutral move, heading for d6, but it's a normal move. I don't think that it's bad for white. Rook e8. Surprising move. The problem was after knight d6, if I play knight d6, rook e7, and knight takes b7, queen b6, he traps my knight on b7. So I can't actually execute knight d6. Rook to d1, queen c7, and then b4. This was kind of a risky setup for me. b4. a4 is a bit more natural. So typically you put the pawns on b3, a4. Although I have to be careful about weakening the dark squares in the position sometimes. Decided to play b4. Not an unknown idea in these kind of King's Indian attacks. Black plays knight b6, and I was very worried about a4. Maybe I should have played a4 myself here. Didn't occur to me. For some reason, a4 didn't occur to me, but that actually makes a lot of sense. If there's one way to stop black from playing knight a4, it's got to be a4. So bishop e3, and then knight takes... This is an interesting position here. He could try knight a4. It kind of bothered me, but it looks strangely placed. Strangely placed. I can play queen d3. I have to calculate very carefully. Queen d3, b5, queen b3, so as not to allow a fork on b2. But interesting line. Anyway, black wanted to play simple chess. Knight takes c4, queen takes c4, and I think that black played this too routinely, and I had a perfect advantage here. a4, rook fd8. I've done a series for another chess site where I did a series of Bobby Fischer games where he played with the bishop pair, and really, this kind of position looks like a Fischer King's Indian attack specialty. I mean, you've got the bishop's space advantage on both flanks. This looks like the kind of position where Fischer would have been really in heaven. b5, c5. I thought an excellent technical example of using like the bishops and space advantage on both sides, creating two weaknesses. I trade rooks here. I don't think that matters, trading one set of rooks, a5. And now we start to get some space on the king side. I think h6 is kind of a weak move. And then knight h7, black plays passively. I have space on both sides. The bishop will start to improve itself. The bad bishop, the bad King's Indian bishop. So black played badly here. He should stop me from activating my bishop. But he didn't let me play h5. Now white has a clear advantage after allowing h5. Black should have played h5 himself in that position. Put the pawns on the wrong color, all on dark squares. But I was in time pressure, and I got an overwhelming position here. After bishop g4, pawn takes pawn. We've got two lines, a weakness on b6. It's really an ideal, I want to show this, it's just like an ideal position. I didn't win because I made some mistakes and got in time pressure, but this is really, really like a dream position. c3 controlling the d4 square, knight d7, bishop f5, and then knight f6, g4, knight d7. And then here I had a move I didn't see, which is really strong. So I played a very, very weak move here, queen e2, which does nothing. I was thinking about maybe queen a2. For some reason I didn't play queen a2. I don't know why I would reject queen a2. But queen e2, that's a very, very silly move by me. I should have played rook a6, but I did not see rook a6, knight b8, and bishop takes c5. This is kind of a cool variation. It's an exchange sacrifice. Bishop takes c5, rook f6, and then something like just retreat the bishop back, and then sack the exchange with knight takes a6, b takes a6, and white has huge winning chances in this position. But it wasn't that easy to see it. So I would have massive compensation for the exchange with excellent winning chances. Rook a6, a huge chance to win the game there. I just rejected it because of knight b8. Then I played passively queen e2, knight f8, rook d1. This is probably a mistake to trade rooks. Keeping the rooks on give me better winning chances. Rook takes d1, queen takes d1, and later on it was difficult for me to make progress. Knight e6, and then I made a very bad exchange here. Bishop takes e6. But I was afraid of knight f4 check. I wasn't really sure, getting low on time, and the game ended in a draw. Let's see some more moves. Bishop takes e6, pawn takes e6. I'm better, but it's very difficult to win in this position. King f7, queen d6. I wasn't sure how to make progress here. If I had more time, perhaps I would find a way to make progress, but it's not that easy. Queen c6 here is an interesting move. I'm not sure I can force a trade of queens, though. Instead, I played queen d8, bishop g7, queen d1. Couldn't find a way to really make progress in this position, and we drew in a few moves. I was very, very low on time, though. I thought this thematic game, though, an excellent example of like a King's Indian attack type position where white has a space advantage, the two bishops, and the principle of weaknesses sort of advantage on both sides of the board. But I failed to find the tactical shot, rook a6, and I also exchanged rooks, which is a mistake, and even trading bishop on e6, probably a slight mistake. So even in the final position, I'm slightly better, but I'm not sure objectively here if it's enough to win. Anyway, we got a good look at a number of games for my Sunday Simul on lichess. Hopefully, every week we can review either a Blitz stream or a Simul stream for your viewing enjoyment here on YouTube. I'm International Master William Paschall. Again, this was a 40-40 Simul I played on lichess.org. I hope you enjoyed the review, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to more games, but we had 45 minutes of instruction. I think pretty solid look at a number of interesting struggles from that Simul. Again, International Master William Paschall, thanks for joining my YouTube channel here. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video. Thanks again. Bye-bye.